Hello and welcome. We have put a lot of effort into this particular episode. It's been 3 years in the making for this particular episode, where we're going to cover the actual history of California in detail and how California was an independent nation from Mexico and America from 1836 to 1846. You're going to hear that phrase in CalExit a lot, that California was an independent nation for a decade from both Mexico and America, just like Texas. So if we talk about how Texas had an independent nation period, California did too for just as long. That's the story. Now, we've gotten those facts out and we've mentioned that, but nobody really gave a detailed history of what exactly happened. How do we know that California was independent from Mexico and America during this time period, 1836 to 1846? Who were the characters involved? What happened? Exact quotes. We're going to prove to you in detail how Californians showed that they were interested in independence going back to 1836 to 1846, and even actually sooner than that. This is the story of how California was an independent nation. 1836 to 1846, California had a history of removing governors appointed by Mexico to rule over them, in a sense, rejecting rule by Mexico. So what you got to understand is at this time, California was still part of Mexico. And Mexico took over a lot of the possessions of Spain when they kicked the Spaniards out and then took over. California was at the far, far, far northern end of the Mexican Empire. And it was seen as a bizarre, far away country, much like Alaska, except this would really be Alaska before we had airline flights. So before you could hop on a plane and easily get to Alaska, this would be the period where America owned Alaska, but the only way you could get there was by ship, and it took really long, and very few people ever got that way, ever got out there. That was how California was to Mexico during the time that it was ruled by Mexico. It was a far, far, far flung province, very difficult to get there. Nobody really traveled on foot from Mexico to California, even though they were connected by land. The mountains got in the way. So a lot of times people would sail all the way around and then sail into the San Diego, Los Angeles, or Monterey, or Yerba Buena, which Yerba Buena was a big city at this period. And what they're really talking about is Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco City. So the Fisherman's Wharf area at the top northern right corner of San Francisco is Yerba Buena. And so the cities you're going to hear are Sacramento, Yerba Buena, which is San Francisco, San Jose. You'll also hear about Monterey, and you'll also hear about Los Angeles and San Diego. But basically from 1836 to 1846, Californians said, we don't care, Mexico, who you sent to rule over us, and we don't care, Mexico, if this is technically your land. We reject your authority. We reject your governors. And they even went so far in 1836 to say straight up, they want full independence from Mexico. So there was something equivalent to the Continental Congress formed in 1836 and something equivalent to the Declaration of Independence signed and drafted in 1836. And so we're going to cover that story. This is the detailed story of how California was independent from Mexico and America. It's the story they do not teach in colleges, universities, or public schools. So if you are going to college in California or your public school child, you will hear none of this. They don't mention this at all. The story that people are taught in California officially is Americans came in, they voted, and they asked to join America. End of story. You won't hear about how the place was conquered. You won't hear about how it was independent and a thriving, diverse international shipping destination for 20 years prior to the invasion by Americans who came illegally. But we're going to make sure you know the story now. But first, check this out and we'll get right to it. So the first piece of the puzzle is a guy called Victoria, and he was in 1828. By the way, all the information comes from this book I don't know how I can. There you go. There. That's the book, History of California. It is this title. So this book, sorry about that, is this title here. So that's the source. Okay, let's get into the actual story. The first Mexican governor that was removed by Californians was called Victoria. He was removed in 1828. So Governor Victoria was appointed by Mexico to rule over California. He did for a little while, but then he was removed by Californians in 1828. So he was a Mexican appointed governor, but this revolt against Victoria wasn't about a desire for self-rule. It was about removing bad leadership from harming the military until Mexico could be convinced to send someone. So what happened was people were generally okay with the way things were being managed, except Victoria did a very bad job paying the military and maintaining the military. And so the folks in the area felt that the military defense posture wasn't really being taken care of. The soldiers weren't really being taken care of. And out of a sense of urgency, very banal, normal politics, not even ideology, they decided to overthrow and remove that governor. And replace him until Mexico could send a replacement. So it wasn't, hey, we are getting rid of this Mexican governor because we want full-blown independence. It was Californians got together and said in 1828, we're going to remove this governor that's supposedly in charge of us. And we're only doing that because he's doing a horrible job with the military defense and we want somebody more competent. So we're going to remove him and vote someone in until Mexico sends a new person. So that's not exactly a full-blown rebellion, but it is the people of California taking the law into their own hands and saying, this guy you sent to us, Mexico, we're going to remove him because we don't think he's doing a good enough job. That's illegal. So Mexico can remove governors or replace them, not California. It was a colony. So this is the people of California for the first time in 1828 taking power into their own hands and removing Victoria, mostly because he was not taking care of the military. Now, a battle did take place outside of Los Angeles in the direction of the Cahuenga Pass. Los Angeles, Cahuenga Pass, and Monterey are going to keep popping up in this period. The governor was severely wounded during this, and he agreed to leave and go back to Mexico on December 5th. So December 5th, they had a battle between the Californians and the Mexican appointed governor. He was severely beaten up and shot up and wounded. And although he kind of won the battle that day, not really, he basically decided that evening that he had had enough and he just agreed to go home. So that was the first time Californians pushed out an appointed Mexican governor against the law because they felt like it. Now, the next person that came was Figueroa, and he came in 1833. And the interesting thing about him is that he was loved. So he was appointed by Mexico. He was really around for about a year and a half, and people loved him. The Californians loved him. So you don't really hear a lot about independence from Mexico during 1833 because the people were happy with the person that Mexico sent. However, the very next year, the Mexican government said that they were going to replace Figueroa with Hijar, Hijar. So in 1834, the Mexican government told Figueroa, hey, you're going to be replaced by this guy called Hijar, and he's coming down to replace you. He was another appointed Mexican governor, but this revolt happened with the approval of the former governor. When Figueroa learned of Hijar's appointment to replace him as governor, Figueroa denied Hijar taking over and said the Diputación, the Congress of the people, has to vote on if they approve. That was not legally correct. So Hijar comes down to California, tells Figueroa, hey, you're the sitting governor. I'm the new governor. I was appointed by Mexico. You need to allow me to take over. And Figueroa says, I'm not going to allow you to take over. The people of California should decide in their Congress, the Diputación, if they approve of you. That was not the law. Again, this is a colony. Mexico can make decisions, period, end of story. Figueroa reinterprets the law and says, well, actually, I think that California people should have to approve of who gets to be governor before they get to be governor of California. So that, again, that's not a revolt. It wasn't the people rising up. It was a sitting governor saying, who was appointed by Mexico, saying, the guy who replaces me should really be approved by the people of California before I'm allowed to be replaced. And that was new. That was Figueroa basically saying, I think the people of California should have some more independence from Mexico. So the guy appointed by Mexico was saying, I think Californians should have more independence from Mexico. That's why it's a little bit different. So Ijar was removed 1834. We still don't consider this the full-blown independence period because people were not rising up together and saying, let's get rid of Ijar. Figueroa basically said, I don't think the public likes you, and I'm going to give it up to a vote to them and see if they approve of you, which was Figueroa giving power to the people of California. The Diputación, the Congress, promptly rejected the Mexico-appointed Governor Ijar around October 14th. Later around March, Ijar was suspected of being part of a rebellion, and Figueroa sent him out. So October 14th, the Congress, the Diputación, rejected Ijar becoming governor, and Figueroa said, well, I guess you don't get to be governor then. So Ijar basically agreed to that, and he kind of just hung out in the area with some people that he brought with him. But then later on, there was a rebellion against Figueroa, and it looked like Ijar was part of it. Can't confirm that Ijar was part of it, but there was a rebellion. The people who were rebelling were trying to take out Figueroa, the sitting governor, and they were connected to Ijar. And so Figueroa said, Ijar, you are banished from California, and he sent him out. Again, not exactly the people uprising, not exactly a rebellion. This is Figueroa kicking out the previous governor because he thought he was part of a rebellion. But you can see how the seeds of independence are rising. So in 1835, Figueroa died. And for that entire year, there was no one in charge of California, nor did Mexico attempt to send someone to be in charge. So that's key. Basically, when Figueroa died, Mexico didn't even bother to try to send somebody to run the place for a year. Think about that. They let America kind of sit there with no leadership for a year. That's what Mexico did. This is how good they take care of the province. This is kind of come into play. Now, in 1836, Mexico again did try to appoint a new governor. Chico, Governor Chico, was sent by Mexico to take over in 1836. Quote, a man of education, though of violent temper, weak judgment, and not very high character. During the 3 months that he remained in California, he did little but issue high-sounding proclamations, bluster, threaten, and apologize. When it was discovered that his niece was actually his mistress, the, quote, public indignation became so great that the governor feared to leave his house. His house was surrounded in Monterey by Californians, and he agreed to sail out of Monterey and leave. So he was a violent man. He yelled at Californians. He issued these high talking point proclamations, and he liked to yell at them, and he was very violent. And they kind of just said, we're tired of you and your attitude. And when it found out that he was basically had his mistress traveling around with him, people got so mad, they swarmed his house that night and said, get out. And so this was the first time that the people of California themselves came together and outright rejected a Mexican governor. This is 1836. So 1836 with Chico. He was only around 3 months, shortest California governor ever. But that was the first time ever with Chico where you saw the Californians say, we don't like this guy that Mexico sent, and we just have the right to remove him. So this isn't like with Victoria, where Californians are saying, we are displeased the way you're managing California, and so we want you removed. And this is different than when Figueroa removed Ijar, because Figueroa was appointed by the government of Mexico, and although he was interpreting the law illegally, he was still technically a representative of Mexico and helping the people of California to kick out another Mexican appointed governor. So it's not a clear independent rebellion until Chico in 1836. With Chico in 1836, for the first time, Californians just basically rose up together and removed him and said, get out. So that was the first Mexican governor rounded up, surrounded by the people of California, and just automatically ordered to leave. Again, illegal, and they can't do that because they're a colony and they're under the control of Mexico. So finally, we get to Gutierrez. He was removed in 1836, same year as Chico. So Gutierrez was removed by locals and the local government in an attempt at rejection of Mexican authority. This is why we focus on this period from 1836 to 1846. He was removed by the, I already had that. November 3rd, 1836. A massive army, by the standards at the time, forms from people all over the land and led by multiple political leaders. They surround the governor's mansion in Monterrey. A single cannonball landed in the governor's house, and he agreed to leave by ship from Monterrey. Quotes, he was a Spaniard and was supposed to favor the new doctrine of centralism, which Chico had made even more unpopular. So centralism was this idea that Mexico said, we're no longer going to be federal republics. People who used to have some level of federalism and freedom, you're going to lose that now, and we're going to have a more totalitarian Mexico controlling you. Chico was very big on that, and so was Gutierrez. The problem was that everybody in California hated that idea because under the federal system, they had more freedom, and under the centralism system of Mexico, which was being implemented at this time, they lost freedom. So Californians didn't like centralism. Chico was a complete ass, made a fool of himself, and was not seen well. And he was a big fan of centralism. So you already have this idea in Mexico that they need to take over more power from California. It's already not popular with California. Then Mexico sends an unpopular governor who's all about the idea of centralism. So they see this idea that they don't like championed by basically some guy who comes across to Californians as Donald Trump. Then Gutierrez comes right after him, and he too is for centralism. So Californians are now, oh God, the guy before you was for centralism, which is horrible for us, and he was really mean and nasty. And now you're saying you're for the same thing? This is a bad sign. The people were beginning to be tired of governors sent from abroad and were ripe for revolution. That's an exact quote. While the Californians had only recently accepted the change from the federal to the centralized system of government, they did not approve it. Quote, the frequent changes of governors that had taken place within the last 14 months and thrown everything into an unsettled condition. Quotes, the sense of dependence on Mexico, which had done little for California for a quarter of a century, except to send in governors who were sometimes none too acceptable, was not strong, end quote. Quote, Chico's conduct further weakened it. Gutierrez was a Spaniard and was as little welcome as Chico had been, and the time was ripe for action against centralized government and centralized governors. After Californians kicked out Gutierrez in 1836, let's see here. After November 3rd, 1836, when Californians kicked out Gutierrez, he was kicked out November 3rd. So after November 3rd in 1336, after they got rid of him, in February of that same year, so they get rid of Gutierrez, a few months pass, they have a Congress, a deputation. February 25th, 1837, a deputación was formed in Santa Barbara. At the first session, the governor submitted a draft of a declaration differing from that adopted at Monterrey, mainly in that instead of asserting independence until the federal system should be restored, petitions the Mexican government to restore that system and allow California to govern itself as a free and sovereign state. So February 25th, 1837 is the first time Californians rounded up the Mexican governor. They told him to get the hell out, and he did. That was two governors in a row, Chico, then Gutierrez. Right after Gutierrez, they get rid of him. And they go, this is kind of a pattern of not good governors coming down here that we have to kick out. They form a Congress, perhaps some would call it Continental Congress. and they issue a declaration claiming independence. Some would call that a Declaration of Independence. See where I'm going here? They form a Congress. They print a Declaration of Independence. This is the same thing America did. They did it February 25th, 1837, and they petitioned that rather than rejoining Mexico when it returned federalism, that they should go ahead and just be independent forever. So 1836 is when we clearly see a vein of independence where people are conscious of what they're doing. They're fully motivated. They're just kicking governors out as they choose. And they're saying, and by the way, we want to be independent. That declaration was promptly adopted and proclaimed by everyone in California. There was a little bit of debate in LA, but eventually everyone in California in February 25th, 1837, signed on to that Declaration of Independence created by essentially the Continental Congress of California at the time, what they called the Diputación. So California is independent, 1836. Things go on for about 10 years. Then Michel Torena was also appointed by Mexico in 1846, and he was removed in 1846. Michel Torena was removed by locals and the local government in a full attempt at rejection of Mexican authority. On February 22nd, a treaty was signed in San Fernando where the governor agreed to leave with all of his convicts. So Michel Torena might have been an okay guy, but he came with what were called cholos, convict soldiers. And they were pretty bad. And around February 25th, he was sort of surrounded, and then he signed a treaty in San Fernando near Cahuenga Pass. Remember how I said San Fernando, Cahuenga Pass are going to keep coming place? So here's another key moment at San Fernando, the Cahuenga Pass. Quote, the battle that followed was as bloodless as the others had been, which had been fought in the same neighborhood years before. The hostile armies confronted each other first in the San Fernando Valley, about 3 miles west of the Cahuenga Pass, where a day was spent in artillery practice at unmistakably safe range. On the following day, there was some more firing on or near the Verdugo Ranch, some 10 or 12 miles from Cahuenga. But on neither field were any men or animals hurt except a mule and maybe a horse or two that were riderless. Then, strangely enough, Michel Torena surrendered. So they didn't really even shoot at each other. You had two armies get together, and they basically did artillery drills and military practice in front of each other until Michel Torena basically realized, okay, they're not going to calm down, and this is probably going to escalate from practice to you're going to attack us, because they were doing it right in front of each other. Now, they were a distance away, so they couldn't actually hurt each other, but they were doing it to say, see, I'm doing these military drills right in front of you, basically like when America does war drills with South Korea right on the border of North Korea. That's what they were doing, and that scared Michel Torena, and then he agreed to leave. And that was February 22nd, 1846. That's how they basically surrounded him at the San Fernando Valley, and they did artillery practices, and it scared him, and then he agreed to leave. And then the story of California independence ends around 1846 because California was then conquered by Americans who came illegally. So the first Americans to California were illegal aliens who came illegally and against the law. And they were accepted, and then they overthrew the government. And then, although California had accepted Americans coming in, even though they were coming in illegally, America said, we're not going to accept any Mexicans, even if you're coming in illegally. So Americans did one thing and violated the law. And then immediately when they were in charge, they flipped the rule book on the people and didn't even do them the same favor that was done to them. So I love hearing about Americans complaining about illegal immigrants in California, because the first Americans here were illegal immigrants, and there wouldn't be a California that's part of America if it wasn't for American illegal immigrants. Facts. Okay, a couple more quotes. Agreeable as Michel Torena had been to make himself to the most Californians, he had not been able to make them forget that he was not of them, even among those who knew and liked him best. The feeling remained that California ought to be governed by California. That's a quote. Quote, the conduct of the cholos, their pilfering from citizens, their quarrels with the sailors who came ashore from ships, and the street fights and occasional murders that resulted had not only been an annoyance to people and the governor alike, but awakened and gradually strengthened a feeling that California had no need for soldiers from Mexico, and that it was almost an insult to the manhood and valor of Californians not to entrust its defense solely to them. So you can see there that while there wasn't a Declaration of Independence, there's a strong feeling of, why are we letting Mexico send these yahoos up here? Why are we letting not people who aren't like us protect us? Why aren't we doing this on our own? Why isn't California ruled by Californians? Basically is the sentiment, and it's widespread. Now in 1836, you had a formal declaration, and then there was a little debate and everybody signed on to it. This time there's no declaration, but in 1846, everybody's on board with the idea of, why do we have non-Californians telling Californians what to do? So you can see how Californians evolved into full-blown revolt against authority. They didn't grab for it immediately. First, there was Victoria. They revolted against him so they could better military defense. Second, there was Ijar, and Figueroa, the sitting governor, helped redefine the law, saying that people have the right to choose. Still not full revolt. Third, you do have a full revolt with Chico, and then fourth, or part of third, you have a full revolt with Gutierrez and a Declaration of Independence. And then finally, fourth, you have a full revolt with a deep feeling of nationalism. So you can go back to 1828. Let's do this right. You can go back to 1828 and see how the seeds are being planted. California is getting used to removing someone and realize they can do it. Then the governor there says, you know what, you guys really should be making your own choices and not Mexico. It kind of puts an idea in their head. The very next year, they do their first removal of a governor. He's just jettisoned out. The next year, they do, Ijar was the person that was removed by Figueroa. The very next year, they removed Chico. And then that same year, they removed Gutierrez, and they wrote a Declaration of Independence. And then Micheltorena came out in 1846, and they got rid of him. And while there wasn't a Declaration of Independence, basically it had awakened nationalism in the California body. And so again, first, there's a revolt for better military defense. Second, there's a sitting governor that redefines the laws for the people on his own against Mexican law. Third, there's a full revolt with the Declaration of Independence. And fourth, there's a deep feeling of nationalism. And so that's how you can see this grows from, they got rid of one governor for military issues. Then they kind of got rid of another governor because he didn't pass the vote. And that put ideas into their head. And then after that, the next three governors, Chico, Gutierrez, and Micheltorena, they just said, you're out of here. They didn't debate. They didn't think about it. They just got together and forced them out. So they didn't do that day one in 1828. It took a little while for them to get there. It took them through the early 1830s. But by 1836, they did get there. And you can see that Californians evolved gradually to independence. You can also see how being California was very important and a big reason so many of the governors were removed. The Californians were talking about culture. They weren't talking about Latino DNA and Spanish language. So when Chico was there, they didn't like him. And then when Gutierrez got there was a feeling that Chico and Gutierrez just weren't Californians. Gutierrez was a Spaniard, and Chico was also seen as an outsider. And so you can see that even though Gutierrez is better than Chico, they really don't like him because he's not from California. He's not Californian. He's a Spaniard. And then they also don't like Chico because he's not from California and he doesn't like a Californian. And then with Micheltorena, we can see in 1846 that there was a strong feeling that, California should be run by Californians. And that was part of the reason they got rid of Micheltorena. And what I love is that this, we can see from 1836 to 1846, the position that California culture is the most important thing. So There are Jewish people in California at this time. There are African Americans. There are African American Jews. There are non-African American Jews. There are Frenchmen. There are Scotsmen. There are indigenous people. There are Latinos. There are Native people. All of those people are Californians. So when the Californians said, "Hey, Chico, Gutierrez, Michel Torena, we don't like you. You're not like us," what they meant is you're like Mexican culture, not California culture. So Californians and Mexicans had the same DNA, Mexican DNA, and they spoke the same language, Spanish. But the Californians were saying, you Mexican governors come over here and you don't talk like this and you don't act like this and you aren't one of us. They weren't saying you're not Latin enough or you don't have enough brown skin or you don't speak Spanish enough. They were saying you don't follow California culture. So you had people of Mexican descent telling another group of Mexican descent, you're not like us. So Californians have Scotsmen, Irishmen, Jews, Frenchmen, indigenous, mixed race, African Americans, etc. They view themselves as California culture. They speak Spanish, and there's a lot of Latin DNA. But this California culture becomes intact 1836 to 1846, consciously in their minds, and they say, you guys from Mexico, you're not really like us. So it was a bunch of Mexican descent people that included Jews and Frenchmen and Scotsmen and indigenous and mixed race people who were telling another Mexican descent people, you're not really like us. We may share DNA, we may share the same language, but just because you're Mexican and you speak Spanish doesn't mean you're one of us. We're Californians, we think differently, we talk differently, and frankly, we want somebody from here who believes in our culture to rule over us. And that is the detailed story. See here. California, we can say that California was independent from America and Mexico, just like Texas when it was a nation from 1836 to 1846, because the people across California and the local leaders all rose up in sentiment and physically pushed out the Mexican appointed governor at the time, and because they wrote down and seriously talked about being independent from Mexico. While there weren't written declarations in 1846 like there were in 1836, the feeling of California should only ever be ruled by a Californian was more palpable in the community and more widespread at that time. However, Californians did decide that they had the right to independently replace a leader if they didn't like them with a vote in 1828. True, they never really had thought about rebellion seriously before, and they weren't imagining that freedom was their goal, rather that they didn't like how the governor treated the military and national defense. It was a sort of very utilitarian, limited rebellion. In 1833, Figueroa was appointed by Mexico and governor, and Californians loved him. So we can't say 1828 to 1836 was also a period of rebellion. There was a sunny little year, almost 2 years, where Figueroa was in charge and Californians had seemingly no interest in an independent land. But the very next year in 1834, Figueroa refuses to allow the Mexico-appointed governor to replace him. True, he had good reasons, and there could be political motivation for himself, but Figueroa just made up and pressed hard that the people of California should approve the governor of California. That was new. In a sense, the state of California refused orders from the federal government. The state government was originally appointed by Mexico, but now it was seeming to say that California should independently decide who ruled over them. Not open rebellion, but the concept that the people of California should decide who ruled them for themselves was firmly established by as early as 1834. You can gradually see how the spirit of rebellion against control from Mexico in 1836 started unintentionally in 1828, and then was nurtured by a Mexico-appointed governor on his way out. But eventually the idea spread to full-blown rebellion, that the people across the land had the right to choose who would lead them, period. End of story, no debate. And they felt that as long as Texas, with its and they felt the way that as long as Texas was its so-failed independent nation, period, that they too could be seen as an independent nation. Okay, that is the whole story. You have all the comments. Appreciate everybody participating and watching it. Hope you enjoyed this story. This was the story of how California was independent from Mexico from 1836 to 1846 and how it got there. This story is not told in colleges, not told in public schools. You can't find it anywhere else, but we covered it here because we went to the source material. And that is this book right here. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you soon. Brexit, whatever. I don't know what that means. Joey Castillo, this is very interesting. So my ancestors are Chumash, Pablo Antonio Cata, and Jose Vicente Felez Anza Expedition. Thank you for this important history. Thank you. Your relatives were part of the story, and I appreciate hearing from somebody who thought this was cool. Maria Daniel, Mania Daniel, thank you very much. That's why we put this out, because nobody's talking about this. Nobody's telling this story. You cannot find it in schools. No teachers will cover it. No professors will cover it. No colleges will cover it. And yet it's the true story of our history. So our history is being denied us. So I want to say thank you, Joey Castillo. And Devil War, I agree. It should be mandatory history in schools. It is not. And the reason is most people don't even know this happened. So we wanted to take step one, making sure you Californians were aware this is happening. This is the true story. We were independent, just like Texas, for just as long. And so when people talk about, oh, California independence, that's crazy. Okay, we were already independent from America for 10 years, full-blown nation. So that was the whole point. Thank you all. I'm glad you found it interesting. That's why we did it. We will see you soon, and enjoy.